The most painful kind of loneliness is not when strangers forget you, but when the people who once needed you stop looking into your eyes. Ethan Park learned that lesson on a cold November evening from the second floor of his own mansion. Rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows as the 38-year-old Korean businessman sat motionless in his wheelchair, staring at the city lights beyond the glass. 3 months earlier, those lights belonged to him. Every tower, every restaurant, every luxury hotel in downtown Chicago carried a piece of his influence. Men stood when he entered a room. Phones rang whenever he gave a single instruction. Then one terrible accident changed everything. Now the master bedroom felt less like a palace and more like a waiting room where time itself had forgotten him. The heavy door opened quietly. Ethan looked up with a flicker of hope that disappeared almost instantly. Madison Reed stepped inside wearing an elegant cream-colored dress and diamond earrings that sparkled beneath the chandelier. Once upon a time, she had rushed into every room searching for him. Tonight, she never even met his eyes. She walked directly to the closet and removed a small handbag. "You're going out again?" Ethan asked softly. Madison paused for barely a second. "It's a charity dinner. I told you yesterday." "I don't remember." "Well, now you do." She adjusted her earrings in the mirror. Her voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was empty. Ethan swallowed. "Will you be home early?" "Probably not." Silence settled between them. The kind of silence that only exists when love has quietly packed its bags and left the room. He looked toward the chair beside his bed. "Could you help me move over there for a while? I haven't been outside this room all day." Madison sighed softly. "Ethan, I really don't have time tonight." She grabbed her purse and walked toward the door. "Maybe one of the staff can help." And then she was gone. The sound of the door clicking shut seemed louder than the thunder outside. Ethan stared at it for several seconds. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals without fear. He had faced enemies without blinking. Yet somehow, watching the woman he planned to marry walk away from him felt like the hardest thing he had ever endured. A few moments later, another knock came. This one was gentle. "Mr. Park?" A soft voice called. "May I come in?" Before he could answer, the door slowly opened. Naomi Carter stepped inside, carrying a silver tray with a bowl of soup and a cup of tea. Her dark curls were tied neatly behind her head, and she still wore the simple black uniform of the household staff. She stopped when she saw his expression. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to interrupt." Ethan quickly looked away. "You didn't." Naomi set the tray down carefully. Then she noticed the blanket had slipped from his legs. Without saying a word, she bent down and pulled it back into place. "It's getting cold tonight," she said gently. "You shouldn't let your legs get chilled." Ethan blinked. It had been weeks since someone had worried about something so small. Naomi looked up and offered him a warm smile. "Would you like me to open the curtains a little? The rain looks beautiful from here." For the first time that day, Ethan looked at another human being and felt something unexpected. Not pity, not sympathy, something even rarer. He felt seen. The next morning, Ethan woke to the smell of fresh coffee and something he had almost forgotten existed in his room: sunlight. The curtains had been pulled open halfway, allowing pale November light to spill across the hardwood floor. For a few seconds, he did not know why the room felt different. Then he heard soft humming coming from the sitting area near the window. Naomi was arranging books on the shelf, moving carefully as if she did not want to disturb him. "Good morning, Mr. Park," she said when she noticed his eyes were open. "I hope you slept well." Ethan looked at her in surprise. Nobody had asked him that question in months. "I slept fine," he answered slowly. Naomi smiled and wheeled a small breakfast cart toward him. There was oatmeal, sliced fruit, and a steaming mug of coffee prepared exactly the way he liked it. He frowned slightly. "Who told you how I drink my coffee?" "Nobody," she replied. "I noticed you never finished the coffee in the kitchen. Sent upstairs, so I tried something different yesterday, and you drank the entire cup." Ethan stared at her. She had been in the mansion for less than 2 months, and somehow she had noticed things that people who had known him for years no longer saw. "You pay attention to everything, do you not?" he asked quietly. Naomi laughed softly. "That is part of my job." She handed him the mug. Their fingers almost touched, and Ethan suddenly became aware of how long it had been since another person had done something kind for him without expecting anything in return. He took a sip. It was perfect. "Thank you," he said. Naomi's smile widened. "You're welcome, sir." A long silence followed. Outside, the first snowflakes of a season drifted through the gray sky. Ethan watched them for a moment before speaking again. "Do you know something funny?" Naomi looked at him. "What is that?" 3 months ago, I had a calendar filled with meetings. People waited weeks for 5 minutes of my time. Now entire days pass and nobody comes upstairs. Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she pulled a chair closer and sat near the window. "Sometimes people do not know what to say when someone they admire is hurting," she said gently. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Or maybe they only admire the man who could walk." The words hung in the air. Naomi looked at him carefully. "I do not think that is true. You barely know me. I know enough." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you know?" Naomi folded her hands in her lap. "I know every employee in this house still calls you sir with respect. I know the groundskeeper says you paid for his daughter's college tuition. I know the chef says you helped his family when his wife became ill. I know people speak about the man you used to be because they miss him." Ethan said nothing. Nobody had told him any of this. He had assumed he had been forgotten. Naomi stood and walked toward the window. "I think they are waiting for him to come back." Ethan looked down at his motionless legs and swallowed hard. "What if he cannot?" Naomi turned around and met his eyes directly. "Then maybe he comes back in a different way." For the first time in a very long while, Ethan did not look away. That afternoon the snow began to fall harder, covering the gardens in a blanket of white that made the entire estate look strangely peaceful. Ethan had spent nearly an hour staring out the window after Naomi's words. Then he noticed something unusual. He was waiting for her to come back. At exactly 3 o'clock, there was another soft knock on the door. Naomi entered carrying a thick blue sweater draped over her arm. "I found this in the closet downstairs," she said. "I thought you might like it." Ethan recognized it immediately. It was his favorite cashmere sweater, the one he used to wear during winter trips to Vermont. He had not seen it since before the accident. "I forgot I even owned this," he said quietly. Naomi smiled. Some things deserve to be remembered. She helped him put it on, carefully adjusting the sleeves. When she finished, she stepped back and nodded with satisfaction. "There, much better." Ethan looked down at himself. It was only a sweater, but somehow he felt more like himself than he had in months. Naomi glanced toward the snow outside. "Would you like to see the garden?" Ethan frowned slightly. "I have not been down there since the accident." "I know. The stairs make that impossible. Not the back elevator." Ethan looked at her in surprise. "There is a service elevator?" "Yes, sir. It goes directly to the conservatory." He almost laughed. This was his house, and somehow he had forgotten an entire elevator existed. Naomi wheeled him toward the door before he could change his mind. A few minutes later, they entered the glass conservatory overlooking the garden. Snowflakes drifted outside, while tiny lights wrapped around the trees glowed softly in the early evening darkness. The room smelled faintly of cedar and fresh pine. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. "I forgot how beautiful this place is," he whispered. Naomi parked his wheelchair near the windows. "Sometimes we stop seeing beautiful things because we are looking at our pain instead." Ethan turned toward her. "You always speak like someone much older than 27. She laughed softly. "My grandmother says I was born 80 years old." The sound of her laughter filled the room, warm and genuine. It made the empty conservatory feel alive again. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan laughed too. It was quiet and rusty, as though he had forgotten how to do it. Naomi's eyes widened. "There it is." "What?" "Your smile." Ethan looked confused. "I did not smile." "You absolutely did." For the first time in months, he felt embarrassed. A strange feeling he had almost forgotten. Naomi sat on the bench beside him and looked out at the snow. "Do you know what I think?" she asked. "I think this room missed you." Ethan looked around. The trees, the lights, the glass ceiling above them. It all seemed unchanged, yet somehow different. "I think I missed it too," he admitted. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Then, from a second-floor balcony above the conservatory, Another voice suddenly broke the moment. There you are. Madison stood looking down at them, her expression unreadable. Her eyes moved from Ethan to Naomi and back again. I've been looking all over the house for you. Ethan looked up, and for the first time in weeks, he realized he had not been waiting for Madison to find him at all. Madison descended the staircase slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor until she reached the conservatory entrance. She looked elegant as always, but there was something cold in her eyes as she glanced at Naomi standing beside Ethan's wheelchair. I did not know you had company, she said. Naomi immediately stepped back. I was only helping Mr. Park get some fresh air. Madison crossed her arms. That is very thoughtful of you. Her words sounded polite, but the room suddenly felt several degrees colder. Ethan looked from one woman to the other. Naomi found a service elevator, he said. I had forgotten this room even existed. Madison forced a smile. Well, I'm glad someone remembered. She looked at her watch. I have dinner reservations in an hour, and I came to tell you that my parents are stopping by tomorrow afternoon. Ethan frowned. Tomorrow? Yes. They want to check on you. Something in her tone made him uneasy. During the past 3 months, her parents had visited only once. That is kind of them, he said carefully. Madison avoided his eyes. I think it is important for everyone to discuss certain things. Before Ethan could ask what she meant, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and immediately smiled. I need to take this. She stepped aside and answered in a voice so soft he could barely hear it. Naomi looked uncomfortable. I should go prepare dinner, sir. Ethan turned toward her. Will you come back later? The question surprised both of them. Naomi blinked. If you need anything, of course. Ido. The words slipped out before he could stop them. I enjoy talking to you. A warm smile spread across her face. Then I will bring tea after dinner. She quietly left the conservatory, leaving Ethan alone with Madison. A few moments later, she returned from her phone call and slipped the device into her purse. Who was that? Ethan asked. Nobody important. You seemed happy. Madison sighed softly. Do we really need to discuss my phone calls? Ethan looked out at the snow again. No, I suppose we do not. The silence between them stretched longer than before. Finally, Madison spoke. You seem different tonight. Different? You are smiling. He touched his face as though he had forgotten how to do that. I suppose I am. Madison looked at him carefully, almost suspiciously. I have not seen you smile in months. Neither have I. For some reason, that answer seemed to bother her. She looked toward the door Naomi had used moments earlier. You have been spending a lot of time with the maid lately. Ethan frowned. Her name is Naomi. Fine. Naomi. Another uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Then Madison suddenly said, You should be careful not to become too dependent on people. Ethan turned slowly toward her. What does that mean? She hesitated. Nothing. I just think staff members come and go. For the first time that evening, a strange feeling stirred inside him. It was small, almost impossible to name, but it felt very much like disappointment. He looked at the falling snow outside the glass walls and realized something unsettling. The person who had promised to stay beside him forever spoke as though everyone eventually left. The woman who was paid to work in his house had simply promised to bring him tea. Later that evening, the mansion grew quiet. Most of the staff had finished their work, and the snowfall outside had turned the grounds into a sea of white. Ethan sat near the fireplace in his bedroom, staring at the dancing flames when another soft knock came at the door. Before he could answer, Naomi entered carrying a silver tray with tea and 2 small slices of apple pie. I hope I am not too late, she said with a smile. The chef made dessert and insisted that someone taste it. Ethan looked at the second plate. Someone. Naomi laughed softly. I may have volunteered you. For reasons he could not explain, he smiled again. Then I suppose I have no choice. She set the tray on the table beside him and poured the tea. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon and honey. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, each holding a warm cup. Finally, Ethan spoke. You seem to know exactly what people need. Naomi lowered her eyes. Not always. You knew I needed fresh air today. That one was easy. And how did you know I needed tea tonight? She smiled gently. Because everyone needs tea on the first snow of the year. Ethan looked at her for several seconds. Who taught you that? Her smile softened. My father. The room grew quiet again. He loved winter, she continued. Every year when it snowed, he would make tea and tell us stories until midnight. Ethan noticed the way her voice changed when she spoke about him. He sounded like a good man. Naomi nodded slowly. He was. And she looked down at her cup. He also spent the last 4 years of his life in a wheelchair. Ethan's hand tightened around the mug. I did not know. Most people here do not. She took a deep breath. He had a stroke when I was 21. Everything changed overnight. Ethan said nothing. At first, he was angry all the time, she continued quietly. He stopped talking to friends. He refused to leave his room. Some days he would not even open the curtains. She looked toward the window where snow continued to fall. Then, one day, he told me something I never forgot. Ethan leaned forward slightly. What was it? Naomi smiled sadly. He said that losing the ability to walk hurt less than feeling like everyone had stopped seeing him. The words struck Ethan like a stone dropped into still water. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, he asked what happened. Naomi looked back at him. I started treating him exactly the same way I always had. I brought him coffee every morning. I argued with him about baseball. I made him sit outside and watch the sunset. A small laugh escaped her. Sometimes he hated me for it. Ethan smiled. I imagine he did. But little by little, he came back to us. Her eyes shone softly in the firelight. Not the same man he had been before. A different man, but still my father. Ethan looked down at his hands. And after that, Naomi's smile faded. He passed away 2 years later. Silence filled the room once again. Then she looked directly into Ethan's eyes. The last thing he ever told me was this. Do not let people bury you before your heart stops beating. Ethan forgot the tea in his hands. Forgot the snow outside. Forgot the pain in his legs. Because for the first time since his accident, someone had spoken to him not as a patient, not as a burden, and not as a broken man. She was speaking to the person he used to be, and perhaps the person he still could become. The next morning, Ethan woke before sunrise. For several minutes he remained still, staring at the pale blue light filtering through the curtains. Naomi's words from the night before echoed in his mind. Do not let people bury you before your heart stops beating. He had repeated the sentence so many times that he could almost hear her voice saying it. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he said. Naomi entered carrying coffee and a small notebook. She stopped when she saw him awake. You are up early today. I cannot sleep. She smiled and handed him the coffee. That usually means your mind is busy. Ethan took a sip and looked at the notebook in her hand. What is that? A list. Of what? She sat down beside him. Things you used to enjoy. He looked at her with amusement. And how exactly would you know that? Naomi opened the notebook. As people. Ethan blinked. You interviewed my staff. Only a few of them. A small smile appeared on his face. This I have to hear. Naomi looked down at the page. According to the chef, you loved trying new desserts. According to your driver, you never missed a sunrise when you traveled. And according to the groundskeeper, you spent every spring planting flowers in the garden. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. I did all those things. Exactly. She closed the notebook. So, I thought perhaps we should start bringing some of them back. He looked away toward the window. I do not know if I remember how. Naomi leaned forward slightly. Then we remember together. The simplicity of her answer left him speechless. A few moments later, she stood up and wheeled him toward the window. The snowstorm had passed, and the first rays of sunlight glistened across the frozen garden. Beautiful, is it not? She asked softly. Ethan nodded. Then something happened. It was so small that he almost ignored it. He felt a slight tingling in his left hand. He looked down immediately. His fingers rested on the blanket exactly as they had every morning for the past 3 months. But this time something was different. Naomi, he said quietly. She turned. What is it? I think. He swallowed hard. I think my finger moved. She looked at him carefully. Are you sure? I do not know. Both of them stared at his hand. Several seconds passed. Then ever so slightly his index finger twitched. Naomi covered her mouth with both hands. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. Ethan could barely breathe. It was only a tiny movement, hardly noticeable to anyone else. But to him, it felt like an earthquake. He looked at Naomi, and for the first time since the accident, there was something shining in his eyes that had not been there before. Hope. Tears filled Naomi's eyes. "Did you see that?" he asked like a child discovering something impossible. She laughed through her tears. "Yes, sir. I saw it." Ethan looked back at his hand as though it belonged to someone else. "I moved." "Yes, you did." Neither of them noticed the half-open door behind them, and neither of them saw Madison standing in the hallway, watching everything in complete silence, her expression suddenly changing as if she had just realized that the future she had already accepted might not happen at all. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Ethan could think of nothing except the slight movement in his finger. It was small, almost invisible, but it had changed something inside him. For the first time in 3 months, tomorrow no longer looked exactly like yesterday. After lunch, Naomi helped him into the conservatory again. She brought a deck of cards and insisted they play a game neither of them took very seriously. Several times, she caught him looking at his hand. "You are checking every 5 minutes," she said with a laugh. "Can you blame me?" he replied. "No, but I think hope makes people impatient." He smiled. "And what do you know about hope?" Naomi looked out at the snow-covered garden. Enough to know that it usually arrives quietly. Before he could answer, the butler appeared at the door. "Mr. Park, your attorney is here." Ethan frowned. "I did not schedule a meeting. He says it is urgent." A few minutes later, David Harper entered carrying several folders. He had been Ethan's attorney and friend for nearly 15 years, and the concern on his face was impossible to miss. "I apologize for coming without notice," David said, "but I thought you should know something." Naomi quietly stood. "I can leave." "No," Ethan said immediately. "Please stay." David looked briefly surprised, but sat down. He opened one of the folders. "Over the past month, several requests have been made regarding your financial holdings." Ethan frowned. "By whom?" David hesitated. "Madison." Silence filled the room. "What kind of requests?" David removed his glasses. "She has asked questions about transferring authority over certain accounts and properties in the event of permanent disability." Ethan stared at him. "Permanent disability. I refuse to approve anything without your consent." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Did she say why she wanted this information?" David looked uncomfortable. "She mentioned the possibility that your condition may never improve." The words hung heavily in the air. Naomi slowly lowered her eyes. Ethan looked out the window, saying nothing. Finally he spoke. "Anything else?" David sighed softly. "There is also a dinner tomorrow evening." Ethan frowned. "Dinner?" "At the house. Madison invited her parents and several close family friends." "I know about that." David looked directly at him. "She told people it would be an important announcement." A strange feeling settled in Ethan's chest. "What kind of announcement?" "I do not know." Silence returned once more. Then David reached across the table and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I may be wrong, but I think you should prepare yourself." After he left, the conservatory seemed unusually quiet. Snow continued falling outside, but Ethan no longer noticed it. He sat completely still. Naomi finally spoke. "I am sorry." He looked at her. "For what?" "For this." Ethan let out a long breath. "You know what is strange?" She waited. 3 months ago, I thought losing the ability to walk was the worst thing that could happen to me. He looked down at his hand. Now, I'm beginning to think losing faith in people hurts even more. Naomi said nothing. She simply moved her chair closer and sat beside him. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan looked at her and asked quietly, "If tomorrow changes everything, will you still bring me tea?" Naomi smiled gently. "Yes, sir, even if things become difficult, especially then." For the second time in 2 days, Ethan realized there was only one person in the entire mansion whose promises sounded completely real. The following evening, the mansion looked as though it were preparing for a celebration. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandeliers, candles glowed along the dining room walls, and soft music drifted through the halls. Yet Ethan had never felt less certain about the future. He sat in his wheelchair near the grand staircase, dressed in a dark suit that Naomi had carefully chosen for him. "You look handsome, sir," she said as she adjusted his tie. He managed a small smile. "I have a feeling tonight is not about appearances." Naomi stepped back and studied him for a moment. "Then let tonight be about something else." "Like what?" She smiled gently. "Truth." Before he could answer, guests began arriving. Madison's parents entered first, followed by several close friends and business associates. They all greeted Ethan warmly, but he noticed something unusual. Many of them looked at him with sympathy, as though they already knew something he did not. An hour later, everyone gathered in the formal dining room. Madison stood near the fireplace, holding a glass of sparkling water. She looked beautiful and perfectly composed. Ethan watched her carefully. He no longer knew the woman standing across the room. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began. The conversations slowly faded until the room became silent. "The last few months have changed all of our lives in ways we never expected." She glanced briefly toward Ethan before looking back at the guests. "Sometimes life asks us to accept difficult truths and make painful decisions." A strange stillness settled inside him. He suddenly remembered David's warning. Madison took a slow breath. "After much thought and many conversations with my family, I have decided that it is time for me to move forward with my life." Several guests lowered their eyes. Others looked toward Ethan with obvious discomfort. "I care deeply for Ethan," she continued, "but his future and mine no longer seem to be heading in the same direction." The room became so quiet that the crackling of the fireplace sounded loud. Ethan felt something inside him grow unexpectedly calm. There was no anger, no sulk, only clarity. Madison looked directly at him. "I believe it would be best for both of us if we ended our engagement." The words hung in the air like falling snow. No one moved. No one spoke. At the back of the room, Naomi stood frozen, her hands clasped tightly together. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes and looked at the woman he had once planned to marry. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled gently. "I see," he said. Madison seemed confused by his calmness. "I did not want to do this publicly, but I thought honesty was important." Ethan nodded once. "Honesty is always important." He placed both hands on the arms of his wheelchair. Then he looked toward Naomi. She stood perfectly still, her eyes filled with concern. Their eyes met for only a second, but somehow it gave him courage. Very slowly, he shifted his weight forward. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable. Then he pushed himself upward. A gasp escaped someone near the window. Madison's glass nearly slipped from her hand. Ethan's legs trembled, and he remained standing only for a few seconds, but to everyone in the room it felt like witnessing a miracle. No one breathed. No one moved. Ethan looked directly at Madison and spoke softly. "The future changes more quickly than people think." The room went completely silent. No one in the room seemed to remember how to breathe. Ethan remained standing for only a few more seconds before carefully lowering himself back into the wheelchair. But the silence that followed was even louder than the gasps before it. Madison stared at him as if she were seeing a stranger. "You can stand?" she whispered. Ethan folded his hands calmly in his lap. "Not for long yet." Her face turned pale. "Why did you not tell me?" He looked at her with an expression that held neither anger nor bitterness. "Because for a while, I wanted to know who would stay when there was nothing to gain." The words seemed to hang in the air forever. Madison opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her parents exchanged uneasy glances. Several guests lowered their eyes. Then Ethan looked around the room. 3 months ago, I believed I had lost everything." He paused. "I lost my health, my confidence, and the future I thought I understood." He turned toward Madison. "But I also gained something I never expected." Slowly, he looked toward the back of the room. Naomi was still standing there, completely stunned. "I learned that kindness is easy when someone is strong." His voice softened. "The real test comes when someone is broken." Every pair of eyes followed his gaze to the young maid. Naomi looked as though she wanted to disappear. Ethan smiled gently. "When everyone else saw a man in a wheelchair, she still saw me." Tears filled Naomi's eyes. "She brought me coffee when I did not want to wake up. She opened curtains when I wanted darkness. She made me laugh when I had forgotten how. The room remained perfectly still. Ethan looked back at Madison. You said tonight was about honesty. He nodded slowly. Then let us be honest. He took a deep breath. The engagement is over. A soft murmur spread through the room. Madison looked shocked. Ethan, wait. He raised a hand gently. No, you made your choice yesterday. I am simply accepting it tonight. Tears appeared in her eyes, but he could already feel something inside him changing. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled him. He turned his wheelchair toward Naomi. Would you come here, please? She hesitated before slowly walking to his side. Her hands trembled. Ethan looked up at her and smiled. I've spent months being treated like I was no longer the man I used to be. His voice became softer. But you never once spoke to me with pity. A tear rolled down Naomi's cheek. Because you are still here, sir. Ethan nodded. Exactly. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver key. He placed it gently in her hand. This opens the conservatory. Naomi looked confused. Sir, I have decided that when spring arrives, I want us to plant flowers there together. She covered her mouth as fresh tears filled her eyes. A few guests quietly wiped away tears of their own. Ethan smiled warmly. You reminded me that life is not over simply because it looks different. For the first time in months, the room no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. Outside, snow continued falling softly beyond the windows. Inside, a broken man had discovered hope, and a quiet act of kindness had changed the course of his life. And on that winter evening, everyone in the mansion remembered something that is easy to forget. The people who treat us like kings are not always the ones wearing crowns.